I want to begin with just a further introduction about who you're getting. Now, if you were to have anybody come up to the podium and talk about suffering and hope, one of the things that I would hope that we would want them to do is to let you know who you're listening to. Because anybody who would be in this position would be coming to the podium with a certain set of assumptions about the nature of the world that we believe that we're living in. And we don't all, and maybe some of us in this room don't all believe that we're living in the same world. That's possible. But I want to let you know the world that I think that we're living in, so that when I offer other reflections, you won't wonder whether or not this is some bait and switch operation. You won't wonder, why is he talking about God? Why is he talking about any of these things? I would want you to know right out of the gate who it is that you're listening to. So I'll just say this, that I come with a set of assumptions. And the first assumption that I make is that I'm a creature, that I've been made. Now, of course, my parents were involved in all that, right? Sex and everything, because sex is usually involved in these kinds of things. So my parents were involved, but I didn't ask, I didn't make myself. I believe that I'm a creature, I'm made. And I'm made by a God who loves us. I'm made by a God who made us because God loves us. He doesn't love us because he made us because he loves us. And he longs for us. The mission of the God who has made us is that we become men and women who are creating beauty and goodness in the world. We are called to create and curate beauty and goodness in the world. This is what we are called to do. And for those of us who are Jesus followers, which I am, we would say that we learn this, as we learn lots of things from everybody else, we learn this on the first 2 pages of the Bible. Remember, I'm just telling you who I am. Because on the first page of the Bible, we learn that one of the things that we are called to be, if we're going to be like God, if we're made to be like God, we are made first and foremost to be artists. You might not think that that's what the first page of the Bible talks about. That's exactly what we're called to be. Everything that we're doing in your profession, in the classroom, in the research, you are creating beauty and goodness in the world. This is what we're called to be. But we're not just called to do this in isolation as individuals. We are called to do this together with other people who are different than who we are. And we are called to do this in connection with those people who are different than who we are, not just men and women, but of different cultures and so forth. But we are also called to do this recognizing that the most durable and the most beautiful acts of creativity take place in actions that are greatly vulnerable and in situations in which shame, the neurophysiologic activity of shame, is not able to be in charge of the conversation. That's on the second page of the Bible. You might not be aware that that's there. You go read it, you'll figure it out. So this is who we are called to be. We are called to be creators and curators of beauty and goodness in the world. Now, you'd think that that's a pretty good idea. But then you get to the third page of the Bible. Some of you might have heard of a person or persons named Adam and Eve. Now, whether you believe that they really lived or didn't isn't really the point. The point is that when you read that story, you can look at it and say, oh, this is us. We are people who are really good at hiding. We are really people who are good at throwing other people under the bus. We're really good at people. We're good at like not answering questions directly. Are you with me? This is who we are. Now, this is not our best selves. This is not who we want to be, but this is who we often are. The more anxious I am, the more likely I am to say, the woman you gave me. We are intended to create and curate and become objects of beauty and goodness in the world. But trauma and our shame undoes all of this. It undoes it all. And we who are Jesus followers would say that God has not given up on his mission still for us to become this kind of a people. And so at the end of the day, we say that this person, Jesus, comes into the world, and there's so much goodness and so much beauty in his life that we killed him. Now, we who are Jesus followers also believe that we don't live in a neutral universe. We believe that there is something called evil, and evil is afoot. And evil has an intention of devouring us. And evil's intention is to devour you and everything that you are serving to create and curate. And evil thought that on Good Friday the story was done. and we who follow Jesus would say, evil didn't see Easter coming. And that new life comes because we believe that a new heaven and earth is coming, and God has invited us to join him in welcoming that forward. Now, I want to say, that's just the story that I believe that we're living in. We haven't gotten to suffering. We haven't gotten to mechanics, which we'll get to in just a moment. But this is who you're listening to, somebody who believes that story. That makes sense? Okay. In my work, what we would say is that when we practice psychiatry, we are not just talking about the story that we're living in, we're talking about the mechanics within which that story operates. All of science is a study of mechanics of all kinds of things. Whether you're talking sociology, whether you're talking quantum mechanics, we're talking about what are the mechanics by which we operate. Science tells us how, it does not tell us about teleology. It does not tell us about why, it does not tell us about intentionality, it does not tell us about purpose. In fact, we might even say, as Michael Polanyi, the famous physical chemist and later philosopher of science, said, there is no such thing as science. There are only scientists. Science doesn't tell us anything, only people tell us things, which is really crucially important when it comes to who are the people in our lives who are telling us the things that we believe are true about our world. Are you with me? We who practice psychiatry, especially in the world of the mechanics of what we call interpersonal neurobiology, believe that the mind is something akin to what follows. This is about mechanics. This is not about purpose. This is not about why. This is about what do we talk about when we talk about the mind. When I was in medical school and in residency in psychiatry, I did not only did I not have a lecture, I didn't have a course on what the mind is. This is a problem. You would think, if you're any orthopedic surgeons here? No, they wouldn't. No, they're not here. The surgeons are they're like busy working. They're busy working. If you're an orthopedic surgeon, one would think that you would know what an osteocyte is. You would know what a bone is before you're going to do your work. Psychiatry doesn't often tell us what the mind is. Now, we know a lot about psychopathology. I can tell you what's wrong when people are not doing well. It's not necessarily as easy for me to tell you what the mind actually is or what it looks like when it's flourishing. But here we go. We would say that the mind is an embodied and relational process that emerges from within and between brains, whose task it is to regulate the flow of energy and information. Now, since you're all academics, I guess I don't need to explain this. You get that. The mind is embodied. The mind is not just my brain. When we're anxious, we know it not just because my brain doesn't actually sense much of anything. I sense that I'm anxious because I sense it in my body. My mind is an embodied and relational process. When a newborn comes into the world, we like to say every newborn comes into the world looking for someone looking for her, looking for someone looking for him. We are primed to be looking to be seen. But those 100 billion neurons in that little newborn's brain are only going to fire about 15 to 20% of them are only going to fire on their own so that the newborn can do what she's ready to do. The other 80 to 85% of those neurons are going to require the interaction with another human brain in order for them to do what they're supposed to do. We need the presence of other people in order for our minds to develop. So my mind is both embodied and it is relational. That emerges, right? It's not just static, it's emerging over time. We become more than the sum of our parts. It emerges from within and between you and me. And its purpose is to regulate the flow of energy and information. All the energy that is the neurobiochemical stuff that's going on within me and within you and between us is taking place. We are trying to regulate that flow of energy and information. By information, we mean that we as human creatures are continually working to make sense of what we sense. First we sense, and then we make sense of what we sense. This is an overly simplified way of talking about it, but we like to say that the mind, the brain, operates bottom to top and right to left. It's an overly simplified way of saying it, but we are continually sensing things, both from inside my body and outside my body, coming from within me and between you and me, and then I'm telling a story about it, and I can't not do this. We're all telling stories even right now. Some of you right now are thinking you're telling a story, I should have gone to the bathroom. Because now I'm sitting in that table, and to get up and leave for the bathroom, he's going to say, you're leaving for the bathroom, aren't you? Right? We're telling all kinds of stories. Some of them are large stories, like that, because going to the bathroom can be really important. But some of them are even bigger stories. I don't believe my father will ever love me. I don't think I can tolerate the rheumatoid arthritis one more day. I cannot live with my depression. I cannot live with my spouse. Because we see that in the middle of all this that's taking place, all of this emerging, embodied, relational process in which we're trying to make sense of what we sense. Thank you, thank you. I'm trying to make sense of that. That's right. That's right. They're telling a story, aren't they? That's right. Somebody's birthday. In the middle of all this, what we are really trying to do with all of this activity of the mind is that we are moving toward what we call, in the field of interpersonal neurobiology, we're moving toward what we call states of integration. The mind has lots of different operating systems, lots of different domains, 9 of them that we won't go into detail about. We have 9 different domains. It's like a 9-section orchestra. Whether we talk about my body, whether we talk about my vertical function, whether we talk about my memory, whether we talk about my attention, whether we talk about a range of different things. All these different forms, all these different domains, it's like a 9-section orchestra. If you can imagine that a symphony has many different sections, and when those sections are really practicing their music well, they're well differentiated. But those well differentiated systems need to talk to other sections of the orchestra. And so they can't just play on their own. They have to listen to other sections of the orchestra. My memory, talking to my state of mind, talking to the way I time travel, and so forth, all the different things that are happening. But once again, in order for me to flourish, in order for me to be integrated, again, these are mechanics, in order for me to be integrated, I necessarily have to have interaction with other human brains in order for this to happen. I cannot do this on my own. Are you with me? And so here's what's important for us to recognize, that if we are designed, if we are intended, if the story that we're living in, create and curate beauty and goodness in the world, do this with others, because in the process you're moving towards states of integration. What trauma and shame do is shatters all of that. And we come to find that the mind runs into a buzzsaw with all kinds of things, in which any number of these different forms, any number of these different systems, of these different domains, are impaired, or they are left unconnected with someone else. Unconnected within ourselves, unconnected between us and other people. And one of the things that we discover that trauma does is that trauma shatters the capacity for the different parts of the orchestra to talk to one another. This happens neuropersonally, this happens neurobiologically. You have a fight with anybody here married to the person, you married to somebody here in the room? Are you sitting at the same table with them? Okay, and thank you for acknowledging that. Like, we have fights. And when we have fights, we feel it in our bodies. We don't, it's not like, gosh, I hope I can have a fight with my spouse today. So well, I'm really looking forward to that at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. No, nobody does that. You would come to see me if you were doing that, right? These are not what we're trying to do. But the point is this, that when we are traumatized in this way, we find ourselves separating from one another. And I don't just separate from you, but certain parts of my mind start to separate from themselves. And I then have to burn energy to contain all of that distress. And that is energy that I do not have available to create beauty and goodness in the world. Are you with me? Suffering, technically, when you look at the literature, one of the ways that we talk about suffering is what happens when we are experiencing pain and we respond to it over time. You could have an excruciating event of pain, and if it's only going to last 10 seconds, That's a very different kind of experience of that pain than if it's going to last 10 years. Suffering is not just about the pain that I have, it's my response to it over time. Is that pretty clear? But one of the things that separates human beings from other animals is not just that we experience pain over time, it's as soon as we do, we start to tell stories about it. I start to become aware, and I ask the question, how long is this going to last? I can assure you, a squirrel, I don't think, is asking this question. Are you with me? I wonder, because I can tell time in ways that no other creature does. I tell time, and the fact that I can tell time affects how I'm anticipating the experience that I'm having, creating greater anxiety, because primarily of something else that my brain does. I always am looking to be connected to people, mostly when I'm in the middle of my most painful circumstances. And what trauma tends to do, it tends to separate me from myself and me from you. One of the things that the pandemic did, it didn't just cause isolation, it pulled the curtain back on the isolation that we as a culture have been ascending into for the last 30 years. Bless you. This is not new, it's just new to us that we're paying attention to it. And so when we talk about how this is going to be how are we going to respond to this thing that we call suffering? There are lots of ways that we can talk about this, and as a Jesus follower, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that, like, there are lots of different ways that we can respond. And I'm going to, this book that I wrote back in August, it is a response that actually invites us to look at a particular text from one of St. Paul's letters to the church at Rome. You're like, what's that got to do with neuroscience? What does that have to do with mechanics? It doesn't have anything to do with mechanics per se. But when we start to think about the text with mechanics in mind, we start to see things. And the text goes like this. Therefore, because of faith you've been justified, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access into this grace in which we now stand, this grace of being loved. And we hope in the glory of God. Not only that, we glory in our suffering, because suffering leads to perseverance, and perseverance leads to character, and character leads to hope, and hope does not put us to shame because of the love of God that has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit, who has been given to us. Now, I don't expect anybody else here in this room to be familiar with that text, let alone to be able to say it. But I want us to pay attention to some things. When Paul says, therefore, since we have been justified by faith, what is faith? Faith is about trusting, and trusting is about attachment. We begin to respond to suffering first by asking the question, what are our attachment structures like? We first want to ask the question, to whom are you deeply known? Of you who are in this room, could you give me the names of 3 people who, if I were to have a conversation with them, they could tell me collectively everything there is to know about you? Are you that deeply known? And by this, I don't mean just they know about you. They don't just know, vital statistics. But we have the experience of, in a community, being seen, soothed, safe, secure, such that before anything else, even when pain comes, I have a different experience of that pain because I know that when the pain comes, you're not leaving the room. Remember that for human beings, there is that one haunting sentence on the 2nd page of the Bible. Haunting. God is going along, doing his creative work. If you've ever read the 2nd chapter of Genesis. And he pauses and looks at Adam and says, it's not good for the man to be alone. It's a haunting sentence, because everything about our suffering is primarily a function of isolation. It does not mean that when we are not isolated, there will be no more pain, but I will tell you that the degree to which we actually suffer has everything to do to what degree do I have the sense that no matter how bad my pain gets, you're coming for me. I'm not being left alone. And the pandemic put us in a position in which everybody was alone. The thing is, we'd been alone for a long time, we just didn't know it. And then Paul gets to this notion that, like, you have peace with God. Like, if you're connected, you have peace. If we think about what we often in psychiatry and psychotherapy, where we talk about this system of understanding the internal mind in terms of what we call internal family systems. Some of you in this room might be familiar with this notion that in our minds, if we were to say, well, you're a daughter or a son because you're a man or a woman, but you might be a father or a husband or a wife. But that's not all that you are. You also have a part of you that gets angry. And you have a part of you that's really proud of things. You have a part of you that gets really sad about things. You have a part of you that's a really great pickleball player. My wife retired in June. She plays pickleball 3 times a week. Like, I got to retire. We have different parts of us that make up an internal family. I have a part of me. My parents were 45 when I was born in 1962. And I had 3 older brothers. They were 18, 16, 11 years old. And like my 18-year-old brother went off to college, and like I was born the next week. And so he could, yeah, you're shaking your head like, Right. I mean, so was everybody else. They're wondering, Lewis, Betty, what are you doing? Well, we know what you're doing, but like what right? And so my brother comes back at Thanksgiving. He's like, what's this? What, right? My father grew up as the firstborn of 3 kids who was far brighter than he was given credit for, never went to college, and was a guy who was like a man of integrity, man who loved his kids and loved his family, but he was also a guy that you didn't cross. We like to say in our family, my dad was not an angry guy, and the reason that he wasn't is because everybody was working so hard to not piss him off. My mom, the 4th of 4 kids, her mother died when she was 3 from an ectopic pregnancy complication. Her father, though he was really bright and really well-educated and well-heeled, couldn't tolerate raising his 4 kids, and so he had them farmed out. My mother basically became like an orphan, going from house to house to house to house, until she finally landed in the home of an aunt who systematically was repeatedly taken off to the psychiatric hospital in fits of bipolar psychosis. My mother would wake up and she would be gone, and her primary attachment figure was not there. And so I grew up in a house in which 2 lovely people, anything that is good about my life, like sits at the feet of my parents. And at the same time, I grew up being really afraid of being angry. And I grew up being like, I'm making sure that nobody is going to be anxious, because I ended up regulating my mother's anxiety for a long time. Like, I started my psychiatric training very young. But what does this mean? This means that there is a part of me, there's a part of me that is always worried about the people who are anxious in the room. And that part, when I sense that you're anxious, I'm going to come into the room, and I'm going to make sure that we're going to do everything we can to make sure that you're okay, even if it costs me myself. And what we discover is that, like, we have all kinds of parts of us that believe that we are at war with ourselves and we don't know this. Are you with me? And I would suggest that even in this room tonight, even as I'm saying this, you are imagining parts of you that you really believe are still at war with the world. And St. Paul comes along and says, you're not at war with God anymore. And this is difficult for us to believe because I've worked so hard to keep those parts of me out of the room. He goes on then to talk about why it is that we can then, because of this secure attachment with God. Notice, this isn't a guy who's writing prescriptively. He's not saying you have to think this. This is a guy who's had this experience. This is a guy who's already suffered deeply. And he's saying, because I'm attached relationally. This is not a religious thing that I know in my head. This is not about a theological idea that I'm just trying to connect it. This is a viscerally felt, relationally felt experience that tells me that even when I'm suffering, because I'm attached, I can continue to persevere. Suffering is not about the presence of pain, it's about the absence of connection. And if I'm connected to you, as we like to say, the brain can do a lot of hard things for a really long time, as long as it doesn't have to do it by itself. And if we persevere, we access all the neuroplastic change that we've now in the last 30 years discovered that the brain is able to do. When I was in medical school, when we were in the neurology unit at the VA, and somebody has a stroke, we're in the hospital for 6 weeks and we say goodbye and good luck. Now if you have a stroke, we send you to a rehab center where for every hour that you're awake, you are doing work, because we are accessing parts of the brain that we didn't think the brain could do that kind of work. So we're doing things that we didn't used to because neuroplastically, if we are going to persevere together, we recognize that we are going to continue to practice being present with each other, even in the presence of pain that doesn't stop. And so suffering, again, is something that in the biblical narrative is actually honored. It is not, we wouldn't say it's a good thing. It's not, God doesn't think it's a good idea, but it is a thing that even when we pay attention to it in this way, and that it drives us to connection in community, it means that even those things that are painful for us give us opportunity to continue to practice allowing ourselves to be ever more deeply loved when evil would want to devour us in the same moment. With perseverance comes character. Character is the outgrowth of what we do when we persevere in the presence of suffering. Character, there are lots of, in the literature, there's lots of different ways that you could talk about character, but in general, we, in psychiatry and in psychology, we talk about character as being those enduring traits of who a person actually is. But it's important to know this, that character actually isn't a thing that we ourselves are often very able to tell about ourselves. Right? I mean, like I tell people, I don't know what people would say about me. I know what people do say about me, especially when I was in Ann Arbor. Okay, I know that. Bunch of pagans. Right. I'm kidding. Not really. Okay. But I don't know what people would say about me, but I know that I would say, like one thing I say, like I am like a professional sinner. I figure if you're good at something and you've done it for a long time, you can call yourself a pro. You've heard of the 10 Commandments? Have you heard of those things? Some of you? Like 2 people have heard of the 10 Commandments. Right. Look, I'm glad that there aren't like 15. Or can you imagine how much confession I would have to be making? Because there's not just 10, there are all these things. I look at my character and like the closer we get to the light, the more we see of ourselves, it just feels so broken. And so it's important for us to recognize that character isn't something that we necessarily always decide about ourselves. It's what other people begin to see because of how we've been persevering in community that's vulnerable in the presence of suffering. And character becomes a durable trait that then leads to hope. And here's the last thing I'll say. Hope is often a thing in our world that we hope happens to us. We think that hope is a thing that just falls into my lap. Most things, as it turns out, are things, when it comes to hope, are things that we are actually already hoping for, whether you know it or not. For instance, when you stand up to leave, you're hoping that the floor will hold. You don't know that that's what you're doing, but that's exactly what the mind is doing. Most of what your hope activity is involved in has to do with lower brain structures that are not part of the middle prefrontal cortex, consciously telling you what you're going to do. Most of your hope activity is automatized stuff. But we know when things start to feel hopeless. But hope primarily is a future state function of the mind. I hope something that's happening in 5 minutes, in 5 years, in 5 decades. I'm hoping for a national championship, right, next year. We hope in the future. But here's something that's important to know about the way the mind works. We remember our futures. The brain remembers its future. Everything that we do when we anticipate the future is based on neural networks that have already given you experience about what you've had that becomes the anticipated future that you are anticipating. Are you with me? Which means hope is not a thing that just automatically happens or doesn't. It is a thing that I form by practicing perseveringly in the middle of painful things in the presence of others who are not leaving the room. And so when I discover that you are willing to love me in the face of my story, no matter what it is, whether it's my medical condition, my psychiatric condition, my broken home condition, all the things for which we suffer, if I have the experience of your not leaving the room, I begin to anticipate a future in which, even if the pain continues, I anticipate that someone will be with me in that moment. And that becomes the future that is hopeful for me, not because it's magically happening, but because we are forming it together even now. Are you with me? I know I sound like a Baptist preacher up here. Like, are you with me? Did somebody say amen? I attend a church where they talk to the preacher. So suddenly the room grows quiet. If you're religious folks, you're probably all just Presbyterians, except for that gentleman back there. So here's what I want to leave us with. We desperately, but no more so than Adam and Eve needed, we desperately need to know that we are being loved by people who are not going to leave the room. The question is not, am I going to suffer? The question is, who is going to be with me when I do? And when this happens, I begin to practice perseveringly, and in so doing, change the neural networks of my mind, because it is not just a thing that I think with, it is my embodied and relational process. And we do so because, especially we Christians, believe that there is a God who loves us who is behind all of this. But even if we don't believe in that God in that story, it doesn't change the fact that that's what your brain is doing. And as we move here, even on this university campus, to pay attention to the question of who are the communities, what are the communities that we can develop that can enable people to know that people are not going to be left alone in the room, that will enable them to know that hope is a thing that they can, with agency, form with practice. To live into a hope of a future of beauty and goodness. You've been very kind. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Aaron, for the kind introduction. Thank you, Dr. Thompson, for the privilege of listening to your thoughts, and everyone else for being able to be here. It's really, really an honor. And I'm privileged for the chance to reflect on this idea of the nature of pain and suffering. And I wanted to start by, as a medical person, a lot of times we spend a lot of time on one side of the bandages. And when you actually go through things, then it increases certainly your depth of understanding. So I wanted to share a reflection from a blog that I found, an occupational therapist named Diana, who had gone through a very painful experience. And I felt like it was instructive to kind of reflect on her blog and her thoughts, which are really profound and relevant when we're looking at our topic today. So she writes about her experience. It feels like a never-ending practice in pain tolerance. Unless you've given birth, there are few things that require so much pain for so much time. Rhythmic breathing helps me calm down. Distraction is the key to getting through. This last stage, it's going to take you into painful, painful territory. My brain would either completely shut down or get very upset. What exactly is hurting so much? Everything. Your legs, your lower back, your arms, all ready to be done. The pain is like the worst type of ache imaginable. It's like your entire body is as sore as it ever has been in your entire life, but you still need to keep moving anyway. And she starts to feel doubts about her ability to get through the experience, and being alone with her own thoughts during all this pain is very, very hard. And at times, all she can do is repeat one foot in front of the other, one step at a time. Is she suffering? What do you think? I'm not saying that rhetorically. Do you think she's suffering, like if I explain that to you? Okay, so I've heard a lot of people saying suffering, and she is suffering. I feel like I would have to ask her, because I think what we maybe understood from Dr. Thompson's remarks was that suffering is sometimes our perspective on the pain, right? Like our interpretation of the pain. I think I heard you say that your response to pain over time and the stories that we tell about the pain from your comments. So if you ask her, it was interesting because in her blog, she does talk about how she's interpreting her pain, and she has a picture of herself at the end of her blog after going through all of this. I wish I could share it with you, but there it is. At the end of that, what it feels like, at the end of that marathon, actually, the end of the marathon. She's actually a long-distance runner, and this is what it feels like to run a marathon, in her opinion. She has no other health problems. You can see her picture at the end. She's looking pretty perky with her medals. So was she suffering? She was experiencing pain, absolutely. As a matter of fact, she writes, to say that the finish line of a race is the magical mix of emotions is an understatement. At the same time, you're in more pain than you could ever imagine, more proud of yourself than you could ever think you could be, and extremely overwhelmed. So how does it feel to run a marathon? It feels like the best and most rewarding type of pain out there. That's why I keep coming back. So was she in pain? Yeah, I think she was in pain. But was she suffering? Like, what is that step from pain to suffering? And I think understanding some of these concepts, which were brought up a little bit in Dr. Thompson's remarks. So pain is usually understood as an unpleasant physical sensation, right? Or it could be an unpleasant experience or an emotion when we're in pain. It can be useful, right? Like if you're standing next to a hot stove and you feel that stove on your hand and you pull your hand away, I think you're going to be grateful that you felt that pain to prevent even more future pain. Suffering involves an interpretation of the experience of pain. The tension that we create around the pain and how we think about and interpret the pain can lead to or prevent the experience of suffering. So I'm building on the comments from the previous thoughts. So do we have agency over this? What do you think? Like, do we have agency over how we interpret our pain? I see a lot of people nodding. So many people would say that we do, right? Like they say that you can tap into ways to control the emotional response or to change your interpretation, right? There may be, so you may be experiencing the sensation of pain, but you're not suffering because of the way that you're interpreting it, right? So people could talk about things like acceptance or mindfulness or reframing or cognitive reframing, and psychologists will have a lot of things to say about how you can, be in that space. And religious beliefs or philosophical beliefs can also help you in that space. So this is what I want to talk about, the decoupling of pain and suffering. Like, how can we decouple those? So as a human being, you're going to experience pain, right? We know this. This is part of this is what's going to happen with us. But do you have to suffer? Do you have to suffer? Or is there a decoupling that we have agency over that we can put in the middle of that, right? And, normally, like I could talk about those things like acceptance and mindfulness and reframing and all that stuff. And if I'm speaking to this surgical intensive care unit nurses, or if I'm speaking in a bioethics grand rounds, you can talk about, okay, and religious beliefs are in that list, right? And then you'd probably kind of stop because, you don't really have permission to talk too much about religious beliefs in many of the academic spaces that you work in, right? But today I had the honor of being able to actually, talk about how religion can really be in that space where it can decouple pain from suffering, or at least lessen it, and hopefully be a useful tool. And I'm going to give you one more example of that. Like, how we interpret what happens can help us, even though we experience the pain, as to whether or not we suffer. Suppose you are in a back alley and you get stabbed in the abdomen and somebody cuts your belly open. You don't know what it's like, maybe totally random or whatever, and you get to the hospital and they have to do surgery to sew you up and everything. And you wake up later, and every time you turn over, you feel that pain, right? You feel the recovery. And probably your interpretation of that is going to be, the world is terrible, I didn't deserve this, life is bad, like, why did this happen to me? And that can increase the pain every time you turn over. Now, what if the hand that stabbed you and cut open your abdomen was the hand of your surgeon with a scalpel in their hand, opening you to cut open a cancer that was threatening your life, and you're recovering from that? So you're still going to feel the surgery, the recovery. Every time you turn over, you're going to still feel the same amount of physical pain. But your interpretation of that can be very much different, right? And you might be very, very grateful. And you might be like, oh my gosh, this reminds me, I had that cancer, they found it, I'm going to be able to live to see my grandkids. This is a good thing. So turning over can even cause Feelings like gratitude to your surgeon, gratitude for somebody being there, even though it's the same physical sensation. And that's what I want to talk about. When you can decouple pain from suffering by putting meaning into that space, then we often have ways that we can cope with suffering, and again, do much better in our way of dealing with it. So reframing and changing our perception so that we don't suffer, although we will all experience pain. So, as I mentioned, like if I'm talking, kind of in an academic setting or a hospital setting, I usually say, I can't tell you how to do it, but, here's how these things things can be meaningful or philosophical or whatever. But I'm honored here to be able to talk about this in forms of religious beliefs and how religion can decouple the human experience of pain with the experience of suffering. And I'm not sure, and Dr. Thompson, maybe you will be able to comment on this later, I'm not sure if when you were talking about we have to suffer and we're going to suffer, do you mean suffer in the sense of we are going to be interpreting pain in a negative way because of, again, I'm not wanting to put words in your mouth, the way the world is, the brokenness of the world, things like that, where are people really suffering? Or are you also saying that potentially the experience that we're going to have is pain, but then the mitigation of that comes from our understanding, our hope, or our belief in faith and things like that? So I would be interested in hearing that, because I wasn't sure when I was listening. So as an Abrahamic faith, Islam shares aspects of belief and practice with other faiths that have as a person's relationship with God as a primary focus. Islam emphasizes worshiping God with love, devotion, and gratitude, living in accordance with his guidance, and God is seen as the cherisher and sustainer of all creation. And so Muslims believe that the events that happen in a person's life are part of God's plan to nurture and develop him or her, and that each challenge comes with an opportunity for benefit and spiritual growth. So illness and pain and suffering, again, in palliative care, in all the hospital systems, people put those together, right? We got to stop the pain and suffering. Are they having any pain or suffering? And yet we're trying to pick that apart. But Muslims believe that illness is seen as actually a state prescribed by God that has the potential to bring a person closer to him. And so with this, like you can see, and this was also mentioned in Dr. Thompson's remarks, there are many things that you can benefit from or gain from in that experience, right? In that experience of pain, that experience of challenge, hardship. And it can be good. The experience can help people appreciate their dependence on God, or increase their sincerity in worship, or bring them closer to God, or expiate for sins, or teach patience, or increase gratitude in times of ease. And so, people are not supposed to seek out suffering for the sake of it, but or pain for the sake of it, when it remains, there are many ways to cope that faith traditions offer. And so I wanted to share a few verses and teachings from the Islamic tradition to help you understand this perspective. And one of the verses from the second chapter of the Quran, be sure that I, God, will test you with something of fear and hunger, and a loss of wealth and lives and the fruits of your toil. But give glad tidings to the patient, those who, when disaster strikes them, say, indeed we belong to God, and to him we will return. They are the ones who will receive God's blessing and mercy, and it is they who are rightly guided, and they who have their Lord's grace and mercy, and they are guided. So as Muslims, we feel that the whole thing is a plan, and that God has told you, you're going to be tested. This is part of this life. This is part of what's going to happen. So we're kind of expecting that and ready for that. Muslims don't believe the world is broken, but they believe the world is exactly as God has created it. Not because God is negative, but because his purpose is beyond ours, and ultimately he knows his wisdoms, but they are beneficent and loving, and that it is our vision that is challenged, right? We don't understand, and therefore we don't understand the greater good and the greater meaning in everything. But meaning from an Islamic perspective would be that God has put you in this situation for your benefit, and everything that God does is good. Now, and so that would be part of that meaning that decouples the pain and suffering for a Muslim. Now, you may say, okay, well, what about if people do it? Gosh, we can understand maybe random things that God does, but a lot of things seem to be done by people or by ourselves. And certainly we understand that a lot of the challenges that we bring upon ourselves. But I think one of the stories that helps me appreciate that God's plan in the world can still be considered God's plan, even if people did it, is like the story of Joseph, right? So his brothers sold him into slavery. In the Islamic tradition, they threw him in the well, and then the slave people came. I think in the Bible it says they sold him directly, but they did that of their own will, right? And yet it was still part of God's plan to have the ending of Joseph preventing famine and being in charge in Egypt and things like that. So that helps in that sense. In the Islamic tradition, there is a belief that God tests those who he loves the most with the most difficult hardships. So the people for whom he wants a special connection, he wants to elevate and bless further and draw closer to him, he gives them hardship to offer them the benefits that we talked about, because often people won't get there if their lives are easy. If we're happy, if we're relaxed, we sit around flipping a lot of channels, doing not too much. But when things get bad, all of a sudden, the Catholic school genuflect memories come back in, and we're on the ground and we're praying and it often takes that hardship to kind of move us out of our complacency. But it's not a benefit for everybody. Some people will become bitter and may turn away from God, but it's an opportunity to get closer to God. And there's a teaching from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Wondrous is the affair of the believer, for there is good for him in every matter, and this is not the case with anyone except the believer. If he's happy, if he or she is happy, then he thanks God, and thus there is good for him. And if he's harmed and he shows patience, then there is good for him. So that's how Muslims review this idea of whatever happens to us. And there's even a teaching that says the illness is the cure. And this was really deep, because a lot of times we spend our time trying to fight illness and trying to fight negative stuff and trying to be like, I have to get cured from this. And that's true. Muslims are supposed to be seeking cure and medical science, to help heal you. That's fine. But you have to understand that there can be healing without cure, right? And this idea that sometimes the cure is in the illness, not sometimes, that what God gives you, he gives you for a reason. And so these are you can imagine it like if somebody gets an illness and then they turn back to God, or they become more spiritual, or whatever it happens, that whatever was ailing them, that was what God gave them the illness for. And so this is how people look at things. And I wanted to end with this last reflection, that the Arabic word for trial and affliction, because we talked about God testing people and God kind of behind this word for distress and affliction, is fitna, a fitna, and it has as its root F, like fa, ta, and nun, like FTN. But the same root has the word fatan, which in Arabic is a goldsmith. So the word for trial and the word for goldsmith are really the same root. And the idea is that a goldsmith takes raw ore, raw rock with gold and sand and impurities, puts it into a fire or furnace, and then because of the heat and the stress, the impurities are removed. And the gold is cleansed of the baser elements and comes out beautiful and pure. So Muslims look at the process of hardship as one that purifies a person, similar to the path that gold has to go through to become pure. And we understand that character and ourselves can be cleansed of impurities and beautified by the transformation of the stress and the heat of the challenges that we face. So religion can decouple pain and suffering. Even though we will have the human experience of pain, we have the opportunity that perhaps we can lessen, or perhaps even not suffer or lessen our suffering, but instead have the hope. That's that opportunity, that what God has prescribed for us to purify us, to bring us closer to him, and to beautify our character in the process is part of what the reasoning behind the challenges and the pain that we go through are. So thank you for the opportunity to reflect a little bit, to keep my bioethics hat on, and to even take that hat off and put my hat of faith on for my own tradition. And I look forward to the conversation with everybody this evening.
I'm going to focus my brief comments on hope. First, I want to thank Dr. Thompson for writing and talking about hope in his book, The Deepest Place. I offer him high praise for taking on the subject of hope, which in my opinion we need to discuss much more in our society. I believe that there is a hope shortage currently existing in this country. And this hope shortage is the fundamental reason behind much of the current individual suffering and also many social ills. In my clinical work as a counselor and in my work as a suicidologist, I visit the deepest place quite frequently. I work with suicidal clients and journey with them and their pain through that deep and dark place. In fact, we know that hopelessness is a greater risk factor in suicide than that of any depression or other mental illness. Of course, the vast majority of suicidal people don't want to die. They want their psychological pain to end. They become hopeless that their situation will not change in the future. And when people have exhausted their ability to problem solve, when they are not able to generate healthy goals, they fixate on the goal of death as an option for pain relief. But of course, suicide doesn't end pain. It merely transfers it to those left behind. I agree with Dr. Thompson that hope can be derived from suffering, as he illustrates in The Deepest Place. We must learn that hope is not an abstract, vague, or even emotional state, but instead a tangible, measurable, and educatable cognitive process. A cognitive process. Indeed, hope has been discussed for millennia as a cognitive principle. In Western world, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle said, hope is a vigorous principle. It is furnished with light and heat and advice, and to execute it sets the head and heart to work, and it animates a man to do his utmost. Page 2. In modern times, the positive psychology movement in the United States has given rise to a cognitive theory of hope. Hope, it turns out, is a cognitive state, not an emotional one. While many emotions are generated by an individual, both positive if they are hopeful and negative emotions if they are hopeless, it turns out that thinking drives an individual's state of hope. Further, it is theorized that hope is made up of 3 parts. Part 1, the ability to generate goals. Part 2, pathways thinking, which is the ability to generate multiple options to achieve these goals. And Part 3, agency, which is the motivation to act on those pathways. Why am I telling you that hope is a cognitive process? Because if it is cognitive, then we can educate people to be more hopeful. I do this with suicidal, hopeless people in my practice. To address Part 1, goal development, I can work with people to develop realistic, measurable, and reachable healthy goals. Part 2, which is generating pathways thinking, I can help people explore various alternative pathways that they may take and the potential obstacles that they may encounter. Part 3, I can help them feel more empowered through encouragement and setting them up with opportunities for success. We can build agency, motivation, self-efficacy, grit, and resilience. Page 3. In preparation for this talk, I had an interesting conversation with Dr. Anna Barrios. She's a colleague of mine who's been suffering with spinal cancer and spinal cancer treatments for several years. I asked Anna about hope, and she told me many interesting things. 2 of these I would like to share with you. The first thing she told me is that chronic pain has become her companion. She wakes each day with pain and goes to bed each night with pain. She's not battling cancer or fighting with cancer. She stated that she accepts it now and it's just part of her life. She's not discouraged or depressed, just accepting her reality. She is actually quite hopeful about many things in her life. And just a comment to Dr. Thompson, she has 2 very loving and supportive adult children, so she's not alone. Acceptance of the things we cannot control in life can lead to freedom to set meaningful goals in other parts of our lives. Our consciousness is free and not overtaken by railing against that which is unfair. The second thing Dr. Barrios told me was that she has come to believe that most things in life are cyclical or wave-like in nature. She used the example of birth contractions. I suppose we're getting back into pregnancy. She used the example of birth contractions. She described these as intensely peaking and then receding, like a wave washing up on a beach. This knowledge that things are wave-like, intense, and then not, gives her hope when things are at their worst. She knows that the pain will recede. She hopes that one day she will be healed, but in the meantime, she is engaging with life. She told me that she has few regrets about how she is living today. She, my friends, is a living example of how even when confronted with chronic adversity, people can make the intentional choice of hope. They can set goals, find pathways around obstacles, and act with agency. Page 4, and there's only 5. Dr. Thompson says that one of the ways that hope is formed is communally. So I would like to leave the individual behind now and make a few brief comments about the hope shortage on a societal level. A recent survey found that only 56% of Americans are hopeful about the future of the U.S. 56%. And only 44% believe that humans will solve major social and global problems in the coming decades. We are becoming a nation that lacks hope. You have undoubtedly seen evidence of these trends too. We could point to polls that demonstrate the lack of trust in government, a decrease in attendance at religious services, and an increase in suicide rates among people from all walks of life, and particularly among young people. This lack of hope is reflected in the historically high rates of anxiety, again, particularly among young people. Anxiety is the #1 diagnosis at the OSU Counseling Center and at mental health clinics around the state and nation. People are not sure where the future is headed, and for far too many, the direction looks bleak. People in America are not hopeful. I do not think that things will get better with either individual mental health or the general feeling of anxiety in society until we recognize the importance of hope in the lives of our fellow human beings. So the question remains, what can we do to instill hope in individuals and communities? I know that it can feel overwhelming and it's easy to feel powerless in the face of these trends, but it seems to me, now that we know that hope is an educatable cognitive process, it changes everything. This understanding of hope empowers us, it motivates us, and it gives all of us the ability to intervene at the individual and societal level. First, at the individual level, we must acknowledge our responsibility to reach out to others and teach them how to hope. Teach them how to hope. We can help people who feel hopeless begin to set clear personal goals and then walk with them on their journey as they start to imagine the pathways they can take to achieve their goals. And we can provide encouragement as they begin to act with agency. Second, we, us in the room, as a privileged community of educators, have the responsibility to help communities and societies move towards the more hopeful outcomes. We can use our scholarship to inform public policy, address widespread challenges such as discrimination, poverty, climate concerns, trauma, and war. Understanding hope as a cognitive process means that we can make a direct link from the academy to the world. We can recognize that the work that we do informs and educates and offers a very real opportunity to engender hope. In fact, it may be our best option that we have. If hope is a cognitive process at the individual level, then it means that at the societal level, infusing data and information into the discussion is a way to engender societal hope. That puts us in a position of great responsibility, but it also means that each of us now can know that the work we do is part of the solution, and that is a very hopeful place to be. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, so this first question says, in your work with patients, clients, and research, is there any conception or understanding of the limits of pain, suffering, and trauma that people can experience before the possibility or probability of recovery is significantly diminished? In other words, does the amount of trauma matter?
Yeah, I was going to say, could they have come up with a more complicated question? It all sounds rather second grade kind of question. There's no question that the nature of trauma matters in terms of, I mean, if you have a femur that fractures in one place, it's clean. Like, you don't want a femur to be fractured, but that's different than having a femur fracture in multiple places, right? I mean, in some respects, this is just, it's fairly straightforward in that sense. A part of the difficulty when it comes to trauma with our emotional health, psychiatric health, is that when the more traumatizing, more shattered I sense my trauma to be, the more urgently I feel the need for it to be resolved. Does that make sense? Which means the whole notion of me as a patient, but also me as a clinician, it's tricky because I want this to be resolved quickly. And we know that there are many things in life that really take a very, very long time. And part of the challenge is that we live in a culture in which we are being trained actively to believe that we should not have to delay gratification, that healing should be able to take place immediately, that our anxiety is something that I should be able to resolve very quickly. But this is, so you recognize that when I have a traumatic experience, I'm now not just going to be addressing my trauma is also being spoken to by the larger culture. I'm not just pushing against what's happened to me, I'm pushing against that in a context in which the very act of healing that we're trying to enter into is being countermanded by a world that says you should be able to get over this pretty quickly. And you should be able to do it on your own, which is not the way the brain works. It's problematic. I'll give that back to you.
Great.
Okay.
Okay,
Should I go take a seat?
please stay up here.
Okay. Okay.
Is there a salutary role in being intentionally alone during suffering?
Yeah. So one beautiful thing about human beings, among many beautiful things, is the whole notion of rhythm. The world, if you just look cosmologically, right? If you look at the world, there's lots of rhythm, right? The whole thing about stars and the cosmos and so forth, and the Earth goes around the sun. You know that, right? Okay, just checking. And then the Earth spins on its axis, and there are tides, and there are migratory patterns, and then you have human beings. When it comes to birth, there is this. Has anybody here ever given birth to a human creature? Right. So there is this thing, right? That we call it labor, and labor begins, and the child begins to leave, and then they change their mind and they come back, and they leave and they come back. Right? This is labor pain, right? The child leaves, and then they leave and they go to college. I mean, this is. Are you with me? But when and then they come back. That's right. But not only that, we come into the world, and we are also rhythmically creatured in terms of like our pulmonary function, and our cardiac function, and our gait function. And we are also rhythmically able to flourish when we move from connection to community to solitude. From connection to community to solitude. Are you with me? And so the whole notion of being alone, apart from trauma, apart from suffering, has its salutary effects. Right? It's necessary as part of the rhythm of what it means to be human. Part of our challenge is when I find myself in suffering when my system actually needs connection with others and nobody's coming to find me. This is part of the problem. So absolutely there are ways in which, of course, there are going to be moments in which I'm by myself, quote unquote, by myself with my suffering. And there is going to be in the same way that my pulmonary function has to reach an apex and then I exhale. But what's most important is then what happens with that suffering by myself, what happens when I come back into community, and the nature of how my experience with suffering is actually not transforming me alone, but also the community in which I dwell. I hope that is helpful.
Great. Okay, one last question. Sorry I can't ask all of your questions. You contributed great ones, but I thought this was very intriguing. At what point, if ever, is it okay to stop hoping?
Okay, so I'm not sure who asked the question, but if they did, at this point, if you were to ask the question from the audience, I would ask you this question in response. I would say, how would knowing the answer to this question be helpful? What's the worry? What is it that I'm really longing for? Are you with me? Notice, when it comes to Q&A kinds of things, notice most human, many, you're researchers in this room, many human questions are really actually in pursuit of information. But many questions that we ask are running cover because we are afraid to name what we actually want. Because if what we want is to know that I can stop hoping, maybe I can say, well, is there a point, is there not a point? I would want to say, as long as you can keep talking to me, hope is always around the corner. That's what how I would want to respond to that. Notice I'm not giving you a binary answer, yes or no, is there a point, is there not a point. I want to be more curious about what's driving your question. I would want to know more about what's the story of your life, even right now, such that that question is emerging. Are you with me? Such that even the fact that we're asking the question in the way that we are, in its binary form, tells us that something is true about your story for which you are longing to have some kind of connection with somebody else who's telling you that no matter how hard, whatever it is you're in the middle of, no matter how hard it is, I'm not leaving the room.